Good morning. Folks can find a seat. Very impressive to have this many people here right at the start. Probably a testament to the interest folks have in this issue. I'm Richard Dennison. I'm a senior scientist at the Environmental Defense Fund, and I'm going to be moderating the panel and making a few framing comments. We're shifting gears a bit this morning to start looking at where the rubber hits the road, is the way I would put it. Where all of the science and technologies that we heard a lot about yesterday start to really come into focus in terms of how they may actually influence decisions. And the first panel we have this morning is aimed at getting away from sort of the focus on individuals to communities. Now, communities are obviously collections of individuals, but there are a number of factors that we'll hear about today that define groups that see interests in the issues that we've been talking about in this workshop of individual variability at a level that they define through a group of individuals that share common perspective, common experience that brings them together to act as a community as opposed to just a collection of individuals. There are many different types of communities with a strong interest in this issue as one part of a broader concern that they have about chemical safety and the influence of environmental factors on health. And if you could bring up onto the slide, under the screens, I want to that's not what I want actually. Do I need to? I hit Smart Podium here, but didn't do it.
Gotta send it back there.
Okay, I'll just talk for a minute. Many of you know that in my day job I work on chemicals policy reform, and as part of that work we have assembled a large coalition of organizations that are united around the need for that reform. And I want to give you a flavor as an introduction to this community's perspective of the broad range of groups that are part of this. So this group is called Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families. It's some 300 organizations. And if we could just sort of start to scroll down, you see first a group of public health organizations. You've got veterans groups. You have a number of organizations that are focused on specific diseases. So the Breast Cancer Fund, the Bladder Cancer Advocacy Network, et cetera. If you go down a little further, healthcare providers, a whole range of organizations that represent healthcare providers are very concerned about this. Nursing organizations, a little further. Learning and developmental disabilities organizations, and there's a whole slew of groups that work on everything from autism to developmental and learning disabilities that are very concerned about this. Labor organizations who represent workers who are often viewed as a vulnerable population. Obviously, some of the national environmental organizations are the usual suspects here, so let's skip over those. Keep going down a little further. Environmental justice organizations, a whole range of groups from across the country at the local, state, national level that care about this issue from the perspective of low-income communities and communities of color. Go down a little further. Mom bloggers. Look at all those women who are mothers who have active blogs that have been organized and come together around this issue. And keep going down a little further. Parent organizations, all kinds of groups that have organized around concern for children associated with environmental exposures. Reproductive health organizations, responding to the growing evidence of the ability of chemicals to interfere with reproductive health. That may be the one. Keep going down a little bit further. I think that may be it. Anyway, that's probably enough to give you a flavor for what we're talking about here. So Now, there are several common things about these communities that have brought them together. One is that they define themselves by reference to a range of factors, some of which are biological or endogenous, like the types we've talked about yesterday, specific disease outcomes around which they've organized themselves, socioeconomic factors, ethnicity, fence line communities that are in proximity to facilities that may be releasing chemicals, or to waste sites that are handling waste, chemical-associated wastes. One of the things that has united many of these groups is a high degree of suspicion around risk assessment as a way of addressing the problems that chemicals face. And that suspicion comes not necessarily from an inherent disbelief in the concept of risk assessment and the need to understand hazard and exposure, but from the way in which it's been applied and the limitations of it that have frequently led to their view that risk assessment is essentially ignoring them and ignoring the problems that that they see in the risks that they face. Some of that comes from the fact that risk assessment has done a very poor job of dealing with things that the average person on the street gets intuitively, that we are exposed to multiple sources of a chemical, whereas risk assessment often looks only at a particular use in a particular setting, that we are exposed to multiple chemicals and multiple environmental agents that may be acting additively, synergistically, in other ways, and we don't have a very good handle on that. That it's the contributions of and the interactions among many different stressors that may actually be the ultimate determinants of our health. Some of those being biological, some of those being pre-existing conditions, differential access to health care, differential access to good nutrition, disproportionately high exposures due to where someone lives or in what socioeconomic class they happen to have been born into. All of those factors, I think, are calls to this group and groups like this to respond to those concerns and to begin to ensure that the methods we are using to ensure the safety of chemicals and other environmental agents to which we're exposed can speak to the concerns of communities that frankly have a very low level of trust in the approaches that have been used. So with those framing comments, we're going to hear this morning on a panel for the next 20 minutes or so from three folks that I have the pleasure of introducing very briefly here, who represent different communities and will bring different perspectives. Dr. Nick Ashford, a number of you who were here yesterday heard Nick, is a professor of technology and policy at MIT. Nick holds an interesting set of degrees that I think inform his perspective. He's got a PhD in chemistry, but he also has a law degree. And he got that at the University of Chicago, where he also studied economics. So that's reflected in his perspective and in a couple of recent textbooks he's written that I was struck by the names of. One of them is Technology, Globalization, and Sustainable Development, Transforming the Industrial State and Environmental Law, Policy and Economics, Reclaiming the Environmental Agenda. So you can see a pretty broad swath of issues that he deals with, and is going to be speaking in particular about his work and experience with the communities that are associated with chemical sensitivity and tolerance, something that Claudia addressed yesterday. Lindsay Witherspoon is the executive director for the Children's Environmental Health Network, a position she's held for quite a few years now, and I've had the pleasure of interacting with her over the years. She's a former member of the NIEHS Public Interest Partners group and currently serves on the Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee for the Environmental Protection Agency and as a member of the Institute of Medicine's Environmental Health Sciences Roundtable. She has a master's degree in public health in maternal and child health from GW University, George Washington. And then finally, our third panelist is Dr. Barbara Biesecker. She's the director of the Hopkins University and National Human Genome Research Institute's Genetic Counseling Training Program. And she's also an associate investigator in the Social and Behavioral Research Branch of the National Human Genome Research Institute at NIH. She also is an adjunct associate professor at Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And Barbara has a PhD in health psychology and a master's in human genetics and has been at NIH for about 18 years. So each of our panelists is going to address their perspective in about 5 to 7 minutes each. I'll try to keep time and make sure that we have enough time to have some discussion with the audience. This session is supposed to go to 9:30. I'm hoping we get a little extra time since we started late. So with that, Nick, could you please take us? And here are the questions for this session, by the way, that have guided our thinking. Thanks.
Much of the perspective that I have on community visions of the involving problem stem from work I did for 3 agencies, ATSDR, EPA, and the Department of Energy several years ago. And it's available on the MIT web. It's also, I can give, called Public Participation in Contaminated Communities, in which we looked at a variety of sites where the federal government, along with the state health and environmental agencies, tried to deal with emerging problems in communities. I'll remind you that it was the problems in Love Canal that gave birth to the Superfund Act and to the creation of ATSDR to look at community-based exposures. Now, there are 2 different kinds of communities. One is the kind of community which is geographically identifiable around a contaminated site. The other are the communities that Richard referred to, which sort of are self-generated people who whose children, let's say, suffer from autism or ADHD, or Gulf War veterans who form a group of people because they have an exposure problem that's not settled by the traditional toxicology. And one of the things which I think is certainly known and should be repeated is that in the contaminated community context, or veterans exposed to Agent Orange, or people whose children have autism, is the first thing that happens is the traditional scientists tell them, this can't be. You can't be suffering from this kind of a problem. In the context of geographical communities, they're told the levels are just too low, so this is all in your head. And at best, what the community is experiencing is the parachuting in of federal scientists who are there to teach them science and why their concerns have no scientific basis. Well, this is not getting off on a very good foot. And it's, shall I say, it's taken us 10 years to come around to what the community knew more than 10 years ago, which is multiple exposures, as Richard said, in communities whose exposures are uncharacterized and complicated, and who come in with a constellation of effects which could be affected by nutrition, by chemical exposures, and by genetics. I mean, whatever the combination and constellations of confounding variables are, the geographically based communities came forward with the presentation that they were not only mad as hell, but they were sick, and they wanted somebody to do something about it. Now, what we observed, and the report that we worked on was co-authored by Kathleen Rust, who left NIOSH as acting director and became the executive director of the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is active these days on climate change and agriculture and other things. But we found basically that when the scientists came in to tell the community they really didn't have a basis for their concern, the immediate thing that was lost was trust. I mean, when people know that they're ill, and there are a lot of people, in spite of the fact that the British attribute this to mass psychogenic illness, I mean, they still believe this kind of nonsense, that the community knows that they're ill, and their children have nosebleeds and the like. Now, we know from today's conference and the preceding conferences that, in fact, the dose-response curve can be influenced by an enormous amount of things. I said yesterday, it's not just that the host makes the poison, the dose makes the poison, but the host plus the dose makes the poison, and the host comes in a variety of sizes and shapes. Part of the problem in recognizing these issues is the fact that the communities that Richard alluded to are fragmented and not connected. You may not see a connection between people who are concerned about autism in their children, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or endocrine disruption, or autoimmune disease, or garden variety chemical sensitivity. You may think these groups of people have no connection, but in fact they have a connection. They have a connection because they have a history of exposure, and probably, and I'll talk about this later, probably we're talking about a new disease theory which involves several steps, not a single agent, single response, as in the case of lead exposure and mental retardation. So there's a complicated pattern here. And these communities have a sense that there are things that are wrong. I remember, it's very interesting, in the St. Louis fuse wrap site, where there were nuclear tailings from where the bomb was made for the Second World War. These nuclear tailings were found under schoolyards, and the community demanded they be removed. And DOE came in and said, we promise that, thank you, yeah, we will do what you want us to do, and we will get rid of the material. And the Department of Energy said, well, we've decided to move it. And they said, where are you going to move it? We're going to move it to the Indian reservations out in Nevada. And the community said, oh no, that's not the solution. You're not going to take our problem and shift it to another community, which shows an evolving psyche and an evolving idea on the part of the community that this is a shared problem, that no community ought to be exposed to these problems. And the science is catching up finally, but the community has lost trust with their scientists. They've lost trust with the federal government, and for reasons which are well understood. The fact that ATSDR is basically not on the leading edge of dealing with the communities in the geographical sense is a sad commentary. They've lost their leadership, and I think we'll hear from my other members of the panel about other groups that have experienced that kind of loss of trust. Thank you.
Good morning. Really glad to be here and be a part of the workshop. My introductory comments are looking through the lens of children as a critical, vulnerable population on their own, and then also when considering the impacts that early exposures can have upon their various life stages moving forward. Being that we still have great ground to cover when it comes to completely understanding all that children are susceptible to, identifying those innovative and effective approaches to characterize their individual variability from biological factors is critical to our advancement in this arena. From my perspective, we have a very unique opportunity before us, which is that by characterizing the range and a distribution of biological variability in children at a more granular level, we are not only developing a protective factor for children specifically, but the general population as a whole. In 2006, EPA released a report titled A Framework for Assessing Health Risk of Environmental Exposures to Children, and I know some of the authors of that report are with us at this workshop. And that report examined the impact of potential exposures during development life stages and subsequent life stages. This framework addresses the challenges of integrating toxicity data and exposure information, which is especially limited during particular life stages like pregnancy and early child development. Problem formulation, analysis, and risk characterization were the three major phases of the process as outlined. And the major findings of the report included the perspective that guidance is lacking for life stage specific evaluation of several system and disease specific areas related to biomarkers and outcomes, mode of actions, dose response assessment, and exposure assessment. The mode of actions can be very useful in understanding susceptibility differences at various life stages, determining when human exposure or outcome data during life stages are limited and not available, predicting types of effects that might be seen during particular life stages, and finally predicting potential susceptible life stages. There's also a discussion of the principles for the weight of evidence considerations across life stages for hazard characterization database. From the network's perspective, as part of our 20th anniversary this year, we are actually hosting an epigenetics and pediatric environmental health conference next month in San Francisco, California. And this is, in our way, an effort to help leverage the focus on individual variability among children and the related public health and policy implications from the growing field of epigenetic research. Now, when considering the public's need to understand the implications of such variability, we need to keep in mind many of the themes we heard in discussions yesterday, such as acknowledging that indoor air pollutants and outdoor air pollutants certainly deserve their own attention whenever possible, and we need to be considering those exposures individually as much as possible. Acknowledging the realities of the built environments where children spend the majority of their time, such as their homes, their schools, and I'll definitely advocate for early exposure in early learning childcare facilities, and the subsequent impacts that early exposures have on not only the health but overall well-being of each child, and for example, the short to long-term educational impacts on their learning disabilities. In my opinion, we are not starting early enough in the stages of a child's development when considering these exposures. In order to understand and assess the real risks to children early on, we need to look in the environments where they spend the greatest amount of their time. And we need to be promoting the safest areas possible, of course, for them to thrive and be nurtured in. There's a good amount of emphasis, if we look back into our history, on homes and assessing homes and even the K through 12 environment. And while we certainly have more than enough ground to cover there, I argue that we are still missing a huge critical of exposure that's pre-K, before children are even entering kindergarten. We know that over 60% of children in this country under age 5 spend up to 40 hours a week, if not more, especially in the DC area with 3 shifts of government employees and military around here, in some form of organized childcare, making those environments a very critical stage for assessing exposures and addressing public health before those children even enter the school environment or in a homeschool environment. The network's Eco-Healthy Childcare Program is one of the only national programs in the country where we are training childcare providers and professionals on environmental health exposures and low to no cost recommendations for increasing and promoting health and safety for children in the care of these facilities, as well as the professionals working in these facilities. You have a lot of pregnant moms, a lot of women of childbearing age that are working in these facilities, which of course are at high risk as well. And I'm sure many of you, especially if you're from New Jersey, may have heard, for example, of the Kitty College incident, which was terrible, where children were actually being exposed to mercury by nature of where the actual facility was placed and the previous use of that facility. There's many, many unfortunate examples like this, and we certainly don't need to be going down that route anymore. Our curriculum, as well as with all of our educational resources and positions, are based in the peer-reviewed literature and depends on the groundbreaking science that continues to emerge in the broad field of children's environmental health. Another huge step forward in addressing individual variability would be to reform the Toxic Substances Control Act, as Richard was talking about earlier, and all the various groups and stakeholders that have been involved in this for a long time. And even the EPA administrator has been very vocal on this for many years now. For those that aren't aware, this was enacted in 1976 to regulate chemicals introduced into commerce, but it has not worked even close to as expected. It does not give EPA the authority to protect human health from the threats of industrial chemicals. The average American assumes that chemicals used to make products like toys and food containers sold in the U.S. are regulated and tested for their health and safety, and we just know that that's not the case. When passed into law, TSCA approved more than 60,000 chemicals that were in existence prior to 1976, and only 200 of the original 60,000 chemicals have been tested for their safe and health implications. And some uses of only 5 of these toxic substances have been restricted. Today, there are more than 80,000 chemicals on the market which have never been fully assessed for toxic impacts on human health and environment. And TSCA allows chemical manufacturers to keep the ingredients of some chemicals secret. Nearly 20% of the 80,000 chemicals are secret according to the EPA. TSCA also makes it very difficult for consumers and businesses to find the information that they need to identify which chemicals are safe and unsafe. And we get countless emails and calls from stakeholders all over the country just wanting to know, what products should I buy? What is quote unquote safe? It's a very overwhelming decision for them. I would offer that the European REACH program provides a useful model for us to consider in some aspects. Under that program, manufacturers and importers are required to gather information on the properties of their chemical substances and to register the information in a central database. When identified, there is a substitution of the most dangerous chemicals when the suitable alternatives are available. And it ensures that industry is able to assess hazards and risks of the substances and to identify and implement the risk management measures to protect humans and the environment. Currently, they're going through a 5-year review, and I think a lot of us will be very interested in what that report comes up, especially with the impact that REACH has had on commercialization and the uptake of products that are emerging in their technologies. So in conclusion, we need to investigate chemicals for their health impacts prior to them being introduced into the market. We need to find safer alternatives to known harmful chemicals that are currently in our environment. And there is more than enough work to spread around among all of us in the various collaborations between researchers, policymakers, public health advocates, and the general public to finally accomplish chemical policy reform, to create and use population-specific research models, and to consider the investments needed to assess and monitor the environments where children spend majority of their time, such as early learning environments and beyond. Thank you.
There. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the committee for this invitation. I was interested to hear people mumbling at breakfast about how diverse the talks have been, and I thought, oh my God, you have no idea what's coming. Is this what I advanced the slides with? So genetic counseling represents my professional background and focuses on helping people to make informed choices. That assumes people have a choice, and often they don't. They've already had an affected child, and they want help learning how to adjust to that. And I'm going to talk about genetic counseling because it represents an entirely different paradigm than the kind of communities that we've been talking about so far. And that's because genetics and genetic testing and counseling around the use of genetic testing has really been based on an individual model. We have no public health models for administering options to use genetic testing. The only mandated genetic testing that exists is newborn screening. And the history behind all of this is, I think, fairly self-explanatory, but that's because of our beliefs and values in reproductive freedoms and in individual choice to use information, and our resistance to sort of state-mandated uses of genetic information to make decisions to have biological children or to continue or not continue affected pregnancies. And so genetic counseling represents a very system-heavy individual approach where we help people try to make decisions whether or not they want to learn genetic information, and if they do learn information, whether or not to act on that information. And that might be increasingly to help manage a health risk, and I can give some examples of this, but I grew up in the one gene, one disease model, which is hysterically funny now because even back then we knew there were many modifiers that we didn't understand that affect variable expressivity and penetrance. However, today we no longer even think about one gene, one disease because of sequencing and microarrays and the complex information that people are now receiving. But we're still based in the paradigm that the one disease, one gene, one disease gave birth to. And the genetic counselors who are practicing the use of genetic testing are still large in a way helping people decide whether or not to continue pregnancies, if something is wrong with the child, whether or not to face a biological risk and have more children, to prepare for disease onset. My last case I just saw at the NIH was a 23-year-old woman deciding whether or not to be tested for a prion disorder that she was at 50% risk for, having 2 young children and knowing there was absolutely nothing that she can do to modify her chance for getting this neurodegenerative disease. It also affects her personality and would probably render her unable to continue to parent her young children. And if positive, means that each of them face a 50% risk of being affected. Those are the kind of decisions that we broker in. She chose to get the information. She was positive. So when we talk about risk assessment, it's not the same kind of risk assessment that you talk about. I'm hearing the majority of you doing risk assessment work in environmental risk factors. Geneticists have often been accused of being determinists, that we sort of ignore the environment. It's not that we don't know that it's there, but we can understand the genetics components better than we can understand the environmental components. And so it's kept us in our camp. And it is very, very exciting that environmental risk factors and genetic risk factors are coming together now to predict risks in a much more accurate way. And I feel very positive for my children's lives to learn more accurate ways of predicting human health risks for individuals based on the combination of those risk factors. We use very rudimentary tools to arrive at genetic risk assessments. Still in individual sessions, we do family histories. And we base our risk assessment on what we know about who's affected in the family and what they're affected with and what their age of onset is and what degree of relationship there is to the patient. We may do our risk assessment based on a phenotype. For instance, there are well-categorized phenotypes where people come in, they have all the clinical features of a certain disorder, but we can't find the usual suspect mutation in looking at their genotype. But we still counsel them and advise them on risk assessment about what we generally know about people who have that phenotype. And it may or may not be accurate, but it's the best we know. We love when we have an actual known mutation in a known pathogenic mutation in a known gene, because then we have more experience generally and feel more confident in our risk assessment when it's based on genotype. But we've all come to now learn the huge variable expressivity, even in a gene like CFTR, which has been known for some time to cause cystic fibrosis. If you have two uncommon mutations in CFTR, you might be at risk for having absence of the vas deferens and none of the classic phenotype of cystic fibrosis. So even when we do risk assessment based on genotype, there's great variation and uncertainty. And it will probably make your skin crawl to know that if you come to me prior to procreating and have a family history of psychiatric disease, and you want to know the chances for having children who might be affected, I'm going to use impaired population risks to counsel you, because that's the best data we have. We don't know how to do genetic risk profiles to advise people in that arena. So it's messy, and we know it's messy. It's been messy for a long time. Thank you. What's also messy is how people process this information. We're very lucky because in genetic counseling, most people come because they want the information. Oftentimes there's a family history or they have an affected person already in their family. And what that means is they know what to expect. And it's much more difficult for people when it's unexpected and unfamiliar, such as a newborn screening result, when people aren't prepared and they have no prior experience with it. People are also... this really is sticky, isn't it? People are also very uncomfortable with uncertainty, and as I've already illustrated, everything about genetic results is uncertain, and it's getting more uncertain. I now broker in sequencing results, which is tremendously uncertain. And I want to just leave you with a couple of lessons from the social science around genetic testing. And this comes largely from health psychology in general, but there are examples in the literature on genetic counseling. Even genetic counselors still fall into the trap of thinking if we can just get them to understand the basic information that it's a 25% chance that a future child will be affected, they will make an informed decision to avoid that risk. Well, risk perception is much more complicated. I'm sorry if that's self-evident to you, but I think we still continue to fall into this trap that there are affective components to risk perception. And there is decades of research that shows that it's risk perception that predicts decisions, individual decisions to get results or to act on them, much more so than it is actual risk. So we all care about actual risk because we're scientists. It's not how information is used. And there is a lot of concern about people's inability to use and broker in numbers and probabilities and health literacy in general. My last slide is to say that, can we go back one, please? Can you go back one, please? So there have been meta-analyses now of a small number of studies done in the cancer genetic testing arena, which has shown that there is less psychological distress around learning that you're at high risk for living with cancer than many of us worried to begin with. And that those who have the worst psychological outcomes had them at baseline so we can screen for them. And there is information that people largely do use that information to manage their health risk in a productive way. So there is hope that people can make rational decisions, even if they're not rational actors. And that communication in disseminating this information in families, at least families who are willing to participate in research, does happen, but is not uniformly good. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
All of the panelists. So three very distinct communities, but a lot of common issues, I think, that you've heard. The floor is open for questions. We're going to put the questions we had come up with to kind of guide this session, but that's only a spur for your questions. And are there microphones? I think, Claire, do you want to head to one of those?
Morning. Thank you all very much. I appreciated the breadth of perspective, the opening up of the vision that you gave us this morning. My name is Albert Donne. I'm with MCS Referral and Resources, but I want to stand here this morning as a proud member of the only subpopulation in the U.S. that the EPA has said in the last 30 years is sensitive or hypersusceptible to carbon monoxide. I'm a middle-aged white male with angina. And I have to raise this question. There's an underlying problem here. If we look at how EPA has worked under both Republican administration and Democratic administrations over the last 30 years, it's still not willing to set standards, to protect even the populations that it acknowledges are sensitive at levels in the environment. Here are data from the primary study that EPA cites as the basis for the standard, showing the effects of CO on angina. And everybody in this red square, a third of the subjects in this study, were not protected by the current standard. So we can do all this work identifying sensitive populations, but if EPA walks away from it, where are we? The other example I give that Ms. Witherspoon is very familiar with, because she sits on the EPA's Advisory Committee for Children's Health Protection. There's also, by executive order, an advisory committee for environmental justice issues in communities that are more affected by pollutants. And yet, in this administration, even less than the prior administration, when EPA makes important rulemakings, carbon monoxide, ozone, particulates, they're not sending those rules to these committees for their comment. So we've created these great mechanisms to bring this information to EPA, and it goes around and issues rules that preposterously claim a carbon monoxide standard will have no greater adverse effect on children, fetuses, or people of environmental justice communities who live in low-income areas that are closer to highways. It's just preposterous. And I don't know how we solve that, but we're spinning our wheels if we don't get that fixed. And I'll leave these out on the sideboards. Thank you.
Anybody want to briefly comment from the panel on that, and briefly? I think it wasn't necessarily a question. Okay. Claire?
Thank you. My name is Claire Barnett. I'm Executive Director of the Healthy Schools Network. We're a national environmental health organization, and for years have been talking about susceptible children in school buildings, largely K-12. And so what I have to say, I think, resonates a lot with what NSAID focused on earlier in the presentation. I want to look at question 3A, do more susceptible individuals want or need different information from others? Let's reframe that with the idea of children. Children don't necessarily need more information. Their parents and guardians certainly need more information. But I think also their physicians and their healthcare providers and their schools need more information. There's another piece of child framing that I'd sort of like to see how that fits into this study group's overall charge, and that is when a susceptible child, a child with existing health and learning deficits, presents themselves either in a child care setting or is enrolled in K-12, what is the obligation of the school to provide to eliminate other environmental stressors? The reality is that unlike adults, children have no choice about where they're going to be, and they can't identify hazards and get out of the harm's way. So I think there's some legal implications here too. Parents need recourse. Children need some level of rights for not just communication, but actual protection from further stressors. I'd like to hear some feedback on that. Thank you.
And so you want to start us off?
Claire definitely knows I'm right in that camp. So I would just, and this probably connects with the last comments too, I definitely agree that there's a lot of politics in this town and beyond. There's a lot of legal barriers to a lot of this. Claire usually speaks about the fact that there isn't really any major federal agency that really is in charge of protecting the health of our children in schools, which is more than ironic and ridiculous. You know, OSHA takes care of adults and as the workers, but if you really look at it, everyone points their fingers when you really get down to who is responsible when there is a now known identified threat to a family and children, specifically due to exposure in a school setting, for example. It is ridiculous that in 2012, we're still at this point spinning our wheels. And I know I'm beyond it. I know all of us and many other folks beyond are beyond it. And I know I don't necessarily have the answer, but I think it's, we don't give up. We continue moving forward. We do the best we can. I know a lot of our states, quite frankly, and Claire's done a lot in New York and beyond, have done tremendous work at the state policy levels and are starting to implement and institute, policies that are protecting our kids. It's slow. It's a process, but it's exciting to see the benefits from other states, being taken advantage as best practices as additional states are considering, what they take on and what they do to at least start to create the parameters and the procedures. The obligation, I think it's, again, a disgrace that we talk a lot about kids, but our policies do not reflect the high emphasis that we claim we have for our children and our future generations. And we need to do something about that. I think it's crazy that we don't have any federal real piece of legislation that really protects our kids. We have the Food Quality Protection Act. We have some language in the Safe Water Drinking Act and a little bit in the Clean Air Act, if you want to get technical. That's it over the course of decades of work. So I could go on and on, but I'll stop. But I think that, this is a huge elephant in the room in many, many cases, and it's a broken system on many different fronts. It took a long time to get here. It's not going to be easy to get out, but I think it's going to take a collective set of voices, researchers and advocates and the public and those amazing bloggers, the parents. I mean, they're phenomenal, and power in numbers.
Mary Lamiel, National Center for Environmental Health Strategies. I had heard an NIHS epidemiologist comment on the difficulty of classifying or understanding Gulf oil exposed adults with multi-system reactions, so folks having headaches and difficulty breathing, flu-like symptoms. And about 2 weeks ago, a top CDC official mentioned that he was talking about children, difficulty diagnosing children who had been exposed to the Gulf oil spill with very complex reactions. And I wanted to ask, particularly of Nick, if he might comment on the potential benefit of an environmental medical unit to study such populations, the importance of getting to a baseline and teasing out that exposure response situation, and also the implications, not just to reduce human suffering, but also the economic benefits and the benefits to public health and public policy, knowing if we understand better exposures and human illness to be able to prevent future illness and disability. Thank you.
Well, those are a lot of questions. Look, the environmental medical unit, which Dr. Miller talked about, is not meant to be a unit which treats a large number of people. The reason it's been suggested, and the NAS workshop years ago endorsed it, was in order to convince doubting scientists that the issue of low-level chemical responses was real, was reproducible on an individual basis, was real, and that removal of people from this exposure could relieve people of those symptoms. Yes, it's very important. Yes, it's a recommendation that should be followed, but it's one of the many things that the traditional scientist and regulatory agency decision maker has to be convinced of to take proper attention. You know, as the previous speaker was talking, a previous question, I was musing. It's often said that we judge the humanity of a civilization by the way they treat their elders. You might think about that. We also should judge the humanity of a civilization by the way they treat their children as well. And whether it's cutting off food stamps or the austerity measures that are now being suggested so that we could deal with the impending economic catastrophe. It is, I mean, I don't know how to mobilize people to be concerned about the fact that we have become a relatively inhumane society with regard to how we make our political decisions. I think it is a very sobering attitude. Now, you know that if you were to count the inches and the minutes dedicated to environmental problems, the overwhelming message is that global climate change is the only environmental problem worth addressing. And I think that has occluded and masked all of the public health problems that a variety of you here have concern to talk about. I mean, there is no real sensitization of the body politic to the environmental questions. We have moved backwards. It used to be that children's health was a major way to promote toxic substances control. I mean, the reform bills talked about the Children's Health Protection Act, masking as a reform of the TSCA situation. We have never been in such a low period of political sensitivity to these issues. And one of the reasons is because children's interests are separated from Gulf War veterans, is separated from the chemically sensitive, are separated by people who have endocrine disruption problems. I mean, all of these fragmented issues which relate to a common generic failure continue to be separated, and politically there just isn't any mileage in this separation.
Thanks, Nick. Let's get a couple more questions. And somebody have a question that might be directed at Barbara regarding genetic variability. George, sounds like you do.
It's not about genetic variability, but it's directed at you. So you brought up something that I have an interest in, which is numeracy, or really innumeracy. And, you know, a little part of my adjunct job is actually teaching genetic counselors about teratology and teratogens. And, part of the art of, I think, the counseling is being able to convey, complex information in an understandable form. I think that, all of the panelists have talked about, our failures as a group in conveying complicated risk assessment information, which is not just for patients and parents, as important as that is, but also for decision makers as well. And I guess I'd just like to get your thoughts on, what we can do better and differently, and particularly now that we're entering an era where it's clear to everybody, that it's not one gene, one disease, one exposure, one disease, but we have all of these little things that each of which provide a small probability, plus or minus, of a disease state. You're actually on the line having to do this every day. Do you have, practical suggestions for us as to how we should improve our ability to communicate complex math?
I think two main comments are that most of the people that come for genetic counseling, as I said on one of my slides, are incredibly motivated and expect to learn relevant information. So I'm going to just start with that group because it's easier to talk about, but that's not true for a majority of the future of what we're talking about. We have to make this information valuable and we have to seduce people into wanting to learn about it. But if we just focus on how adults learn, so I rarely hear at any of our conferences from adult educators. It's critically important to understand how people learn new information. And two, social science. It's only been in the last decade that social science has met genetic counseling. So genetic counselors have been practicing for 25 years before that based on good gut instinct. And it's reprehensible not to use the things we know about what affects risk perception, how people grapple with probabilities and different ways to teach them numbers. And so we have to start taking what we know from social science and adult education and applying it here. We also have to talk to people who do mass media education and marketing people. They know how to affect change. We need to bring that into the health arena substantially so that we can use some of the effective ways to change understanding. That said, genetic counselors probably, in general, I know this because I listen to their audio tapes every week, give people too much information. So the first thing we need to do is figure out what's the most important information, break it down into small chunks, and relate it to what people already know. That's how we learn as adults, and it's infrequently done. And it's not that hard to do. The other thing is we have to get these young people who know how to use technologies to start developing. We're going to start testing an app soon, developing these resources so that they can graphically represent probabilities and information in different ways. There's actually already some science that tells us how people better understand risks depending on how you're represented on a graph. We need to start using these resources and making them generally available on the internet so that it doesn't depend on having 10 or 15 or if we're lucky 60 minutes with a patient to describe these things so that people are motivated self-learners.
Okay, I see 4 people standing. I think that's all we're going to have time for. Brief questions, brief answers. Let's go over here, Duncan.
Yeah, Duncan Thomas, University of Southern California. I really appreciated the genetic counseling perspective. For a lot of classical Mendelian disorders, there ain't much you can do about your genes. But there are certainly with the modern complex disorders, there's often environmental modifiers. I'd like to hear your perspective on, well, first of all, how often in your clinical practice you're called upon to make recommendations about environmental modifications that could affect your future risk, what you see as outstanding research challenges, and how we can turn your perspective on environmental modifiers of genetic risks around to the benefit of this audience who are more concerned with genetic modifiers of environmental risks.
So there's 2 major arenas where that's taking place now, and that's the subspecializations of genetic counseling in the cancer arena and in cardiovascular work. And so now panels are starting to be done, risk factors are being communicated back to patients, and management decisions are being made on that information. But that's in cardiovascular work, that's very new introduction in the clinic. So the best data comes from cancer genetics, where genetic counselors now recommend people modify their risk status. So the intentions are early detection of cancer, so screening if people don't want to take extraordinary measures such as prophylactic surgery, and for certain people who are very, very anxious about having a high chance of developing breast or ovarian cancer, actually having their ovaries and believe it or not, their breasts removed, so to minimize their risk for ever getting cancer. So there are management decisions that are now being introduced in genetic counseling and a subset of genetic counselors who use those risk predictions to help decrease the chance that people are going to get cancer.
We'll be coming back to some of the research needs questions in a final panel, and Barbara will be on that one as well. Louis?
Lou Gross, National Institute for Mathematical and Biological Synthesis at the University of Tennessee. As someone who is trained in probability theory, I know how difficult it is to get across the basic concepts. I would just like to point out that what we know from the mathematical education work that has been done is that there is variability in how people understand mathematics, and that there are a variety of different ways of explaining the same idea. And hopefully the genetic counseling community is aware of that and if not, perhaps we can help in sort of how to do that. On another point, just down the road from here in Annapolis is a new National Science Foundation Synthesis Center on human and environmental connections. And I would encourage those of you who are thinking about how to deal with the connections between human perceptions of risk and the feedback on environmental issues to consider partnering with them. They are one of our partners. It's called SESYNC, SESYNC.org is their website. And if anyone's interested in talking about how to combine those from a sort of scientific perspective of combining human responses and perhaps social responses with biological ones, I'd be interested in talking with them. Thank you.
Stephen McFadden, Independent Scientific Research Advocates. I'm a child of the Manhattan Project, Westinghouse Science Talent Search finalist, and I have a degree in physics. There's a growing issue regarding sensitivity to electromagnetic fields. I have not heard it mentioned at this meeting. The probability of having electromagnetic sensitivity and having chemical sensitivity, they correlate about 30%. And these are not typical people, but there is definitely an effect. There's definitely a biological mechanism. I would suggest that if you remember the major histocompatibility complex looks Y-shaped like a tuning fork. And if there's any dipole moment, and if you throw some electromagnetic frequency, you're likely to kick loose an electron and kick off second messengers and modulate intercellular communication, which affects the immune system. It affects teratogenesis and so forth, and cancer. I would like to see this committee on emerging science hold a meeting on electromagnetic effects with respect to sensitive subpopulations, because I have not heard that subject mentioned at all at this meeting. Thank you.
Claudia, I think you're going to have the last question.
Thank you. Having witnessed the illnesses at the EPA from the beginning, in following those individuals and also working closely with the VA on the Gulf War veterans situation, all these groups are developing multi-system symptoms and multiple new onset intolerances, and no one is recognizing that pattern of illness. We see the same thing happening down now in the Gulf of Mexico with populations, communities who are exposed, workers who are exposed to these petrochemicals, which are complex mixtures. One might say, well, there couldn't be that big of a problem, it can't be toxic. But in fact, you see this with a lot of petrochemical exposures, whether it's mixtures of indoor air contaminants, the things that Gulf War veterans are exposed to, which are myriad, and now what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico. Yet despite the fact we've communicated to NIEHS, and I've spent a whole year with NIEHS, they are not using questions concerning people's new onset intolerances or looking at this in the context of this toxic-induced loss of tolerance. And the sad thing is that people are getting sick. They're searching for doctors. They're going around the communities trying to find help, and they don't understand the underlying dynamic. When I worked with Gulf War veterans, at least we could talk about that, even though there were no environmental units at that point. There was no, the doctors weren't recognizing this, but there are important things that can be done. So if people develop these multiple intolerances, they need to understand the pattern of emerging intolerances, and that now things in their own homes. They shouldn't be using pesticides if they're developing these kinds of problems. They shouldn't be, exposing themselves to solvents. Even a lot of indoor air chemicals, like we talked about yesterday, can continue to perpetuate their symptoms, even though the original exposure is over with. They're continuing to be sick, and no one is informing them how to reduce their symptoms. So the research tool of the environmental unit is important for informing scientists, something doctors can pick up on eventually once it's established. But even using a simple tool like the Queasy could be used with these exposed populations. Thank you.
I'm sorry, we're running out of time here. Just one program note. The agenda flipped 2 items, so I think we're going to be going next, before a break, to next talk, and then have a break thereafter. Let me ask you all to thank our panel for a very interesting morning.